We are in day 3 of our civil rights movement, and today we looked at civil rights through the lens of African Americans. And I want to take you back to the first minute of the first day of this unit when I posed the question, hey, what do you all know about civil rights? I have asked that question dozens of times over the years. Almost 100% of the time, this is the image that pops in people's head. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying that's bad. I think it's awesome that a lot of you went to the Henry Ford Museum and sat in the bus. I'm very happy that that bus is here in the Detroit area. All good, all positive. However, there's a lot more to the story, and the story goes back before the 1950s. And unfortunately, in your education, you hear so much about Martin Luther King. You hear so much about Rosa Parks that a lot of people don't know the deeper story, okay? So I'm going to try to remedy that through this PowerPoint here. So let's go back to the very beginning. So 1607 was Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement. And by 1619, slaves were being brought from Africa to Jamestown. So slavery in this country is almost as old as our country itself. Okay, and a lot of people didn't know that. A lot of people didn't know slaves were in Jamestown, our first permanent English colony. In 1776, the Continental Army enlists African Americans to fight the British. A lot of people don't know that either. So the black story is the American story. It's intertwined, okay? And the incentive to fight was if you fought, you were freed from being enslaved. And here is a painting showing that. And most people didn't know those first two facts. Let's jump ahead to 1787. The Constitution provides 3/5 of a person for a slave to count for representation. Now, we already learned about that. And the Constitution, fantastic document. One of the more brilliant documents in human history. This particular 3/5 compromise would be the exception. I think a lot of people feel uncomfortable with this because in modern times to say a human being counts as 3/5 of a person, that's pretty distasteful probably to all of you. Okay, so it's a longer history than the 1950s. 1807, America stops the importation of slaves. However, by 1807, there were a lot of enslaved people already here, in particular in the South. And it didn't stop slavery, it stopped the importation of slaves. But in the South in particular, a lot of enslaved people, those populations grew and grew and grew, and obviously it culminated in the Civil War, which was fought over slavery. Okay, Dred Scott versus Sandford, 1857. Now, this decision was based upon the story where Dred Scott was a slave and he went to free territory. And he was thinking, well, hey, I'm in free territory, I'm free. Well, unfortunately for him, the Supreme Court said no. Okay, if you are a slave, you stay a slave. And bear in mind, this is 4 years before the American Civil War, a precursor to that Civil War. And then the Civil War was fought. 4 years, 620,000 people dead, which is 2% of our population. Very troublesome time, but 3 amendments grew out of that conflict. We call those the Civil War Amendments. Civil War Amendments. So the 13th Amendment got rid of slavery. Okay, so that was the culmination of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment, I'll read this to you, Section 1. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, this is pretty cut and dry. All people are subject to the rights and privileges of this country. So that was the second of the Civil War amendments. And then the 15th Amendment allowed black men to vote. Okay, so at this point in the story, the trajectory is moving in a little more of a positive direction, but it wasn't all good. But there was a time that things were continuing to improve during Reconstruction. From 1865 to 1877, we had an opportunity to rebuild a new country. And Reconstruction was a tough time afterwards because you have these newly freed slaves, and you had the death of Lincoln, and you saw this change and this rebuilding of this country after our worst conflict to that point. Okay, but things were actually moving in the right direction. Here's a primary source. Here's a stimulus we may see in the future, and you can see these are black congressmen. So we were getting some representation politically from black people. So things were moving along pretty well until the wall. Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but equal. Now, you can say it was separate but equal. Now, it was separate, but it certainly wasn't equal. And that ushered in an era called the Jim Crow era, which was Plessy, separate but equal, to Brown versus Board, which was the integration. So in red here, there's some terms, de jure and de facto. Now, hopefully you remember that. Now, de jure would be a form of discrimination or segregation that is legally protected. It's in the laws, whereas de facto, it's not in the laws, but it's the way it is. It's the reality of things. So, for example, redlining in real estate, or banks not giving loans to African Americans, that sort of thing. So these 58 years had both. They had de jure segregation and de facto segregation, and it was a rough stretch. Okay, and in U.S. history, you saw, those pictures and videos of different movie theaters and different drinking fountains, and that was a pretty rough stretch in our history. But let's fast forward to 1964. Things started getting a lot more positive. And you can see President Johnson here and Martin Luther King, and they are shaking hands. And you can see the energy in the room if you look at the people. There seems to be some happiness there. There seems to be some positivity. This guy here, he looks pretty happy. Good for you, pal. I'm happy for you. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It prohibited unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools and public accommodations. Essentially, we have this piece of legislation that said you cannot discriminate. So we're moving in a progressive direction in the 1960s. Very close to that piece of legislation was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was designed to let all people vote, all citizens can vote, and to eliminate those obstacles that were put in Black people's path, in particular in the South. Okay, so that's the story outside of what you were taught in U.S. history. Okay, and I wanted to tell you that story. And now I'm going back to what you did learn in U.S. history. So if you're watching this video because you were absent, please go to Google Classroom, and there's that rectangle there that says Letter from Birmingham Jail from Dr. King. And there's an activity that goes along with it. And I do really need you to know this. There's a high likelihood this is going to be on the AP exam. And it's a very interesting read. And I want to end with a fundamental truth. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it is moral. Okay, don't confuse the two. Now, ideally, what is legal is also moral, but throughout our history, we've had some pretty immoral laws, and people fought against it, like Dr. King. Dr. King, with his civil disobedience, made a very powerful statement to people throughout the country, and it did bear fruit in the end, like we just saw with those two big pieces of legislation. So anyway, I hope you know more than you did before watching this, and I appreciate you watching.